Dear Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you for this beautiful Sabbath day that you've given us and for the bread that we have been fed so far this morning, or whatever time of the world on this Sabbath it may be. We pray, Lord, that you would bless Elder Tess now as she shares your message. Lord, that you would grant us hearts that are prepared to hear, that your word and your purpose would take root and not be moved. We pray for preparation for the times that we are going through now and for what is coming, Lord, that we would be part of the mighty mountain. We thank you and we ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So I'll start, as always, with a review of last week. Really, of what we've done until now. We've been comparing ancient and modern Israel. A week is a long time, so I know that some things may have been past our minds, and there's just key points I want to make sure we don't forget. So we have this bringing out of God's people, a denominated people with a specific task or set of tasks to fulfill. We have ancient Israel. They are drawn out of darkness, of captivity, at which point of time in that darkness they have lost the Sabbath. Just the same, if this is the end of the 400 years time prophecy, we have the end of the 1260 year time prophecy. There was darkness, captivity, and in the 1260 the Sabbath truth had been lost. God raises up a deliverer, Moses. He's going to draw a people out of the pagan nations that surround them. God raises up a deliverer, William Miller. He's going to draw a people not out of pagan nations, but out of apostate Protestantism. The Sabbath will be reintroduced. It won't be that there has to be a process that both parties go through, ancient and modern, before the Sabbath can be reintroduced. It couldn't be reintroduced in Egypt, and it couldn't be reintroduced to God's people while they were still in the Protestant churches. Both are drawn out of Egypt, out of Protestantism, and then the Sabbath is reintroduced, reinstituted for that group of people. Around the same time period, you have the raising up of a prophet. So ancient Israel, for whatever other pioneers they had, the prophet they looked to specifically, particularly, was Moses. He was their prophet. So for ancient Israel, they looked to the Decalogue, the books of Moses. For modern Israel, we look to Ellen White. She's the prophet for Adventism. So around the same time period, you also have the beginning of the writings of the prophet. In ancient Israel, it's the same person. In modern Israel, there's a distinction between Miller and White. You have, in that Alpha history, a failure of that drawn-out people to be fit to do the work. All things considered, what should have happened was the work should have been completed here. They should have conquered Canaan, and when they conquered Canaan, they should have quickly, if they had followed that system that was being discussed this morning, the yearly Sabbaths as well as the weekly Sabbath, they could have been fit to do a work quite quickly after entering Canaan. But we know the apostasy that they continued to go into, the idolatry. The same thing for the Millerites. They should have been preparing the way for the Second Advent and find it completed in the 1860 history. And we looked at a quote from 1868 that made that very, very clear. They didn't because they were not fit to do that work. They had also held on to tenets of Protestantism, which is the Laodicean condition. So ancient Israel, they held on to part of Egypt. Modern Israel, they held on to parts of Protestantism. It's particularly that Protestant idea of the millennium that makes people, whether or not you ascribe to each part of that millennium doctrine, but to make oneself comfortable here on earth, because we don't know when Christ will come back. We know it will be far in the future. It's the idea behind Protestants and behind these Adventists in the 1850s. We don't know when Christ will come back. We have a long period of time. For Protestantism, they're thinking about the 1,000 years. For Adventism, we no longer held to that. But it's the same mindset of making oneself comfortable here on earth, because we don't know how long it will be until Christ returns. So we have the Laodicean condition. This is failure. This is failure. We described in more detail ancient Israel to show how their idolatry was the idolatry of Egypt. It's the Apis bull. And this Apis bull, as it relates to the king, the characteristics of a king, that was what they wanted in not only God, but also in their visible leadership. So someone sent me an interesting thought that I believe is relevant. When they ask for a king, they're given Saul. And Saul has all the characteristics of this Apis bull. He is tall, he is respectable, he appears powerful, he can lead them in battle. It's the characteristics of Saul that we find them desiring. They continue that through all of that history, both at Mount Sinai with the golden calf, which was the Apis bull, down through their request for a king at Ramah, the height of idolatry. So when we think about that, I want to make an important point that we don't forget. And that is that this Apis bull, they weren't saying that they were bowing before another god. They were saying that this is the characteristics of our true God, Jehovah. So they were able to justify their idolatry. What they'd done is they'd taken Jehovah, and this is a crucial point. They had taken Jehovah, their true God, and ascribed to him the characteristics of a pagan deity. So when they're bowing before this golden calf, they're saying, we're worshipping Jehovah. But these are his characteristics, and we want to be able to see him. When they come out of Babylon, they let go of the image. They no longer need to see him, but they hold on to the characteristics. And as we've discussed at length, that's their problem when Christ comes. They're looking for the Apis bull, and when Christ comes, they're not able to recognize him. So I want us to consider, just remind ourselves of this history. When Christ comes, he's going to re-educate them through the teaching of parables. And parable teaching is to take literal, to build a spiritual application. So, a shepherd, literal, is God. A sheep is you. So it's taking a literal story or a literal picture or a literal history, a literal culture, and making a spiritual application. And that is his cure for their misunderstanding about the nature of their king. So I just wanted to take us to Desire of Ages. Desire of Ages 2:11.3. In this whole section, I'll put sources down here. I just want to pick up a couple of thoughts from this section. 2:11.3 to 1:2.4 and 2:13.2. This is where Jesus is dragged before the Sanhedrin on the charge of Sabbath breaking. The time, the place, the occasion, the intensity of feeling that pervaded the assembly all combined to make the words of Jesus before the Sanhedrin the more impressive. The highest religious authorities of the nation were seeking the life of him who declared himself the restorer of Israel. The Lord of the Sabbath was arraigned before an earthly tribunal to answer the charge of breaking the Sabbath. When he so fearlessly declared his mission, his judges looked upon him with astonishment and rage, but his words were unanswerable. They could not condemn him. He denied the right of the priests and rabbis to question him or to interfere with his work. They were invested with no such authority. Their claims were based upon their own pride and arrogance. He refused to plead guilty of their charges or to be catechized by them. So, over when you get to this history, the Omega history, what are the Pharisees holding to? The Sabbath. That's what makes them particularly a peculiar people. So down in this history, that they don't see themselves as having anything in common with Egypt or Babylon or Rome. They are the special people, the people drawn out and separated from these nations. After coming out of Babylon, they built walls between themselves and these other nations. They saw themselves as being the peculiar covenant people. And a major part of that was that they had the Sabbath truth, the Sabbath that had been given to them to honour and protect. So when you come down to the Omega history, is the Sabbath the testing question? No, it's not the testing question. Was there any danger of the Jews breaking the Sabbath in this history? No, it wasn't the threat of the Jewish nation. Egypt, definitely. Babylon, there's a risk come in Babylon that they can keep their Sabbath. This history, no risk. The Sabbath was not the issue. In fact, the person who's given to them to prepare them for what's about to happen, for the giving of the message to the Gentiles, which we line up, by the way, with the Sunday law, has that got anything to do with the Sabbath? No. Because of his mission, what is he charged with? There's 3 specific things that Christ is accused of. The first one is Sabbath breaking. They're saying he does not honour the Sabbath. The second one is that he dishonours the prophet. We're given a prophet. Ancient Israel has a specific prophet, and he's accused of dishonouring the writings of Moses, the prophet. The third one is of sedition. And what is the charge of sedition? Sedition is the accusation of creating a political movement that is opposed to certain political governments. Being a political movement opposed to the government of the glorious land. So I want us to be aware these are the 3 accusations that come against Christ in a history when the Sabbath is not their danger or their test. Does that stop when they go to the Gentiles? Does that stop them making the Sabbath a testing prerequisite of baptism? No. 34 AD, when they go to the Gentiles, if one of those Gentiles is to be baptized, what do they have to accept and keep? The Sabbath. There's no change in the position or the belief of the honouring of the 7th day. But still he faces this accusation of Sabbath breaking. Continuing to read that quote. They would receive a false teacher because he flattered their pride by sanctioning their cherished opinions and traditions. But the teachings of Christ did not coincide with their ideas. It was spiritual and demanded the sacrifice of self. Therefore, they would not receive it. They were not acquainted with God, and to them his voice through Christ was the voice of a stranger. Because Christ did not bring a message that agreed with their cherished opinions and traditions, then they rejected him, while at the same time they would accept a false teacher who sanctions their cherished opinions and traditions. Because they're not acquainted with God, they cannot recognize Christ. It's the same rewording of the same issue we've discussed before. They don't understand the kingdom. They have cherished opinions and traditions about the kingdom, so they cannot recognize the king. Christ says, "Had you believed Moses, your prophet, ye would have believed me, for he wrote of me. But ye believe not his writings, how shall ye believe my words?" So even though they cherish this prophet, they are the descendants of Abraham and Moses. These are their fathers. They cherish them, they lift them up. It was Christ who had spoken to Israel through Moses. If they had listened to the divine voice that spoke through their great leader, they would have recognized it in the teachings of Christ. Had they believed Moses, they would have believed him of whom Moses wrote. We've already made this point before. I'm just labouring over it. Where in the writings of Ellen White do you have her discuss the danger of vaccines and the danger of the Illuminati? The danger of these secret societies that are united behind every earthly government? You don't find them. They don't exist. These ideas we do not find in the writings of our prophet. Just the same as the ideas of the Pharisees, what they held on to, you could not find in the writings of Moses. These are their cherished opinions and traditions that have been accepted as a part of our faith, as if they were the writings of our prophet. But they are not there. And because he does not reinforce and sanction these cherished opinions and traditions, he is accused of dishonouring the prophet, breaking the Sabbath, and being a political movement opposed to the government of the glorious land. You know, I'm making a direct compare and contrast. What this movement is currently accused of is of being against the Sabbath, not because we don't require it for baptism, not because when we go to the Nethinims, to the world at the Sunday law, we won't insist on the keeping of the Sabbath, but because we don't see it as the great test of the history of the 144,000. Just as it wasn't at the end of ancient Israel, it isn't at the end of modern Israel. Because we do not hold to that tradition, we are accused of breaking the Sabbath. We're accused of dishonouring the prophet, Ellen White, because of how we read and understand her writings, the same way Christ was accused of dishonouring Moses, and also of being a political movement opposed to the government of the glorious land. They misunderstand the nature of the kingdom, therefore they misunderstand the nature of the king, therefore they do not find themselves prepared when their test as God's people comes to them. The exact same history is being repeated with modern Israel. With many there is an apparent desire to be much in prayer with God. This is 1888. (1687), paragraph 1. Note, this is in 1888. With many there is an apparent desire to be much in prayer with God, and yet when the word comes from the Lord, they are startled into resistance, and they exclaim against it and the messenger, as did the Jews. So they exclaim against the message and the messenger, just as did the Jews in ancient Israel, saying, "He is tearing away the very pillars of our faith." In their blindness, they do not comprehend what constitutes the pillars of our faith. So this is the 1888 history. And Ellen White is facing an accusation in the 1888 history that she is dishonouring the Sabbath. The reason that they're facing that accusation is because of the doctrine of righteousness by faith. 1888, externally, it's all about Sunday laws, blue laws in the United States. And everyone knows, is being told, Ellen White is telling them, we're under the cry of the third angel. So Ellen White is speaking in this time period about people who believe that they're safe in the 1888 history, in the history of Sunday laws. They are safe because they have the Sabbath. And she says they are dividing up the third angel's message. Is the third angel's message the Sabbath truth? Yes, but not only. The third angel's message constituted multiple truths, and when they accepted the Sabbath and rejected other elements of the third angel's message, they're in a false sense of security. She said they will fall. So even in the history of Sunday laws, there is more than the Sabbath truth. And that brings against those bringing those other truths the accusations of dishonouring the Sabbath and tearing away the pillars of our faith. And her point is, those making that accusation in their blindness do not comprehend what constitutes the pillars of our faith. The answer to all of this, once we get into our history, is parable teaching. To take the literal, to explain the spiritual. And that's exactly what we're doing now, taking ancient Israel, the literal, to give us a more understanding of the spiritual. So we're doing this, literal, spiritual, but we're doing something else. We're also doing a compare and contrast with our Alpha history to our Omega history. So literal, spiritual, but also literal, Alpha, the beginning, explains the end, Omega, spiritual. So we also need to learn from our Alpha history. From September last year, I have spent much time on the end of ancient Israel and explaining the fractals within that history, the two calls for the church, then the call for the world, the whole Gospels into the book of Acts explaining the history before they go to the Gentiles. In the spiritual, explaining the history that leads up to the Sunday law when we go to the world. That has been laboured. What we are doing more and more is now focusing on this history, our Alpha, our beginning, as it explains the end. So just as ancient Israel, we have failure, success. In the Alpha history, they went into the Laodicean condition, and it resulted in failure. 1888 also resulted in failure. It gave rise to 1888 gave rise to a good deal of Pharisaism in the Adventist church, setting up walls between us and not just those other Protestant religions who want to bring in a Sunday law, but also we built up these brick walls between us good holy Adventists who keep our garments to show our morality and our it's essentially the same ideas of Pharisaism. They didn't just separate themselves from pagan nations, they saw themselves as holy compared to all those unholy Jews who weren't as moral as they were. Conservative Adventism, you can see it line upon line, it all fits, have gone down the same road. Coming back to 1798, we want to see what happened here. There was this split within Protestantism. It really rose up in the First Great Awakening in the early 1700s, but it's all these external events. These external events, such as the American Revolution, you have the French Revolution, you have with all of that, the Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, the forming of the United States. In all of these massively momentous external events, you have those political changes impacting Protestantism. If you have free thought, inherent rights and freedom through the state, through the government, what about in your church and your freedom of thought within the church? So this begins to divide Protestantism into these two factions, all of these external events. And everyone is aware of these momentous external events. So prior to 1798, just prior to it, you have the beginning of the Second Great Awakening. And this is a second great religious revival within Protestantism. And this revival isn't going to stay purely religious. It's going to also show not just to religious camps, but to political camps. And they're best summarised in the 1800 election, 1798 being the lead up to that election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So if you come down here in 1800, you've had George Washington as president, John Adams for one term, and now John Adams is running for his second term as president, but he has a rival in Thomas Jefferson. So you have Adams and Jefferson. And we showed how these also show the division within Protestantism. The old conservative guard supporting Adams, and supporting Adams because he was a strong religious, not just personally religious man, but also defending it through the state. We read quotes by Jedediah Morse. Explaining how that the United States was as Israel. So Israel came out of Egypt, found freedom. The United States found freedom from Great Britain. So they saw themselves as being in that dangerous period just after finding freedom. Israel from Egypt and the United States from Great Britain. So this kind of conservative thinking, what they were doing, as we described, is they're taking a literal story and making a literal story. Because if you have Israel come out of Egypt, then what does the success of Israel depend on? It depends entirely on their own keeping to the moral code. They have to keep the Saturday Sabbath. If they don't keep the Saturday Sabbath, what's going to happen to the nation? They'll be destroyed. So if the United States individually, if they don't keep the Sunday Sabbath and demonstrate that from the highest levels of government, what's going to happen? They're going to be destroyed as a nation. This is the thinking that's going to lead us all the way to the 1888 thinking and the Blue Laws. John Adams is not doing well as a president. One fellow that some of you may know from YouTube, John Green, Crash Course US History, a good set of videos to give a very quick overview of US history. He describes John Adams as being as the greatest thing John Adams ever did as president was hand over power. He's not looked that kindly on in history. And part of it was he had this very monarchical view of the role of a US president. Some of you may be aware of a what's his name? They've made a musical on him.
Hamilton.
Hamilton. Some of you may be aware of Hamilton. What was his first name?
John.
We can keep with Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton. Mind blank. Alexander Hamilton he's on the US $10 bill. Obama wanted to have him removed and replaced on the $10 bill. But he has become people have such a renewed interest in him in the last few years, they scrapped those plans and they've kept him on the bill. Alexander Hamilton was one of the founders. He formed the Federalist Party. So if you look at John Adams, this is the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson is the Democrat-Republican Party. This election, this 1800 election, is the first election in the United States when you have two formed political parties running candidates. So the very first election where you see the same dynamic as you would expect to have today. So you have John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Behind John Adams is this fellow Alexander Hamilton, who's become quite famous. And Alexander Hamilton surely viewed the success of the United States as needing a very strong presidential power. He wrote most of the Federalist Papers. So it's just an interesting bit of history, what happened in this election. John Adams, he was so unpopular by now because of what he did in 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts. These two sides, this Federalist side, as opposed to the Democratic Republicans, one of the things that divides them is their allegiance to foreign powers. The Federalists supported Great Britain. The Democrat Republicans supported France. So you have the support of Britain and the support of France. They want to support Britain because they want the trade, those political connections. Thomas Jefferson, his side, supported France because of the French Revolution and the ideals of freedom. So there's this division between supporting Britain and supporting France. They're divided by a number of these dynamics. So as Alexander Hamilton, he's supporting John Adams. John Adams is knowing he's not going to do well in this election, and there's many French immigrants coming to the United States. So what do you want to do when you have an immigrant population who isn't going to vote for you? Well, you want to start to curtail the rights of the immigrants to vote. So that's partly what's behind this 1798 Alien and Sedition Acts, the alien being the immigrants to the United States, particularly targeting French immigrants. So John Adams, he wants to prevent those immigrants from being able to vote in the next election, because those immigrants are largely French, and they're going to support Thomas Jefferson, who is allied with French interests as opposed to the interests of Great Britain. So in 1798, he wants to start taking or restricting the rights of immigrants into the United States. He makes it, I think it was 5 years before an immigrant was allowed to become a citizen and vote. He extends that to 14 years. And then there's also the Sedition Acts. Multiple people who spoke against his government or said just mean words about him in newspapers or in one fellow, there was even one drunk man who just shouted something offensive to one of the politicians in his administration. They were imprisoned, they received extensive fines, and there was quite a number that were imprisoned under those Sedition Acts. You were not allowed to speak against the government. That also was very unpopular. So Alexander Hamilton supporting John Adams. Thomas Jefferson is running for this 1800 election. Thomas Jefferson is running with another fellow, Burr. But the election system in the United States then, it hadn't yet been very well refined. There's many problems with that election system. So when this side wins, when the Democrat Republicans win and the Federalists lose, there's a split in the Electoral College vote. There's equal numbers go to Burr and equal numbers go to Jefferson. So that either one of them could have become president, and this is because they hadn't refined their system and it still wasn't clear who would be president and who would be vice president. So Jefferson and Burr, that vote is split in the Electoral College. No one knows how to solve it. So Alexander Hamilton, who was on this side of the equation, now that his party has lost the election, he throws his weight of support behind Thomas Jefferson. He says quite mean words about he says quite mean words about Barr and supports Thomas Jefferson. which leads to, in 1804, Burr has had enough of Alexander Hamilton and challenges him to a duel, and Burr kills Hamilton. That's how Hamilton dies. And it's because of his treatment of Burr, particularly in this 1798 to 1800 election. So it's a complicated process, but there's this original split between the Federalist Party, here their candidate John Adams, and this Democrat-Republican Party led predominantly by Thomas Jefferson. And we showed how this also showed the split within Protestantism. And what you have is this being the Protestants, Jedediah Morse, supporting this literal to literal view. They see Jefferson as being this anti-God, atheistic power that is essentially satanic, and they subscribe to him the conspiracy theory of the Illuminati, that he is part of the Illuminati. And because Hamilton was being quite mean to John Adams, they also say Hamilton's part of the Illuminati. So you can see how they've created, Jedediah Morse has created this deep state. He's saying it doesn't matter what political party you belong to. Hamilton is part of the Illuminati, and Thomas Jefferson is part of the Illuminati. That's why he says the Illuminati is based in the home state of Hamilton and the home state of Thomas Jefferson. It's essentially the idea of a deep state. There aren't these two political parties. Instead, you have this entrenched deep state behind them, which is essentially satanic, however you want to use the word satanic. It's against the government and the will of God. And our only hope is John Adams. It just becomes interesting when you bring that to our day and you start seeing this idea of a deep state, this satanic union that crosses political parties. This literal to literal interpretation leads Jedediah Morse to make the astounding claim that the success of the nation depends on the enforcement of morality, including in 1798, he's already saying including the enforcement of Sunday keeping in the United States. This literal to literal interpretation, they're also using conspiracy theories. This idea of a deep state that is essentially behind the scenes satanic. This division in Protestantism didn't go away. It extended down into the history of the 1850s, when this discussion about slavery starts reaching a dangerous pitch inside America. At the end of the studies in Portugal, we discussed the 1844 election and Henry Clay. Henry Clay stated that the church divisions, the division within Protestantism, was the greatest source of danger to the United States. What this senator is saying, this senator who was one of the two candidates for the 1844 election, he's saying the greatest source of danger, the greatest threat that the United States currently then faced was the split within Protestantism. And it's over the issue of slavery. So the great external test of this history, it split Protestantism. Before 1844, the Methodist Church was the largest organisation in the United States outside of the federal government. It divided, it split officially in 1844. A strong cord tying north and south was cut. 94% of southern churches belonged to one of the three major bodies that were torn apart. Suddenly, in a religious sense, the South was set adrift from the Union. So the churches split between North and South before the states split between North and South. Civil War Times Illustrated explains that the church divisions helped crack America's delicate union in two. By severing the religious ties between North and South, the schism bolstered the South's strong inclination towards secession from the Union. It helped bring about a breakup in the national political parties, which splintered into factions, and the shattering of the parties led to the breakup of the Union itself. The divided churches also reshaped American Christianity. Important new denominations such as the Southern Baptist Convention formed, and Christianity in the South and its counterpart in the North headed in different directions. Southern believers who had drawn on the literal words of the Bible to defend slavery increasingly promoted the close, literal reading of Scripture. So what is the South doing? The same methodology as used by Jedediah Morse. It's the literal to literal reading of Scripture. Israel comes out of Egypt. You have to enforce morality. John Adams was the candidate who they had hope in doing that. He didn't succeed to do that. Israel goes into the promised land. It is instructed by God to practice slavery. Literal to literal interpretation. This article is recent. It's just an online article. It says only 9 years ago were Southern and Northern Presbyterians reunited. So it's only in our lifetime that Presbyterians reunited, about 125 years after the end of the Civil War. And few observers expect reunion between Northern and Southern Baptists. American Christianity continues to feel the aftershocks of a war that ended 125 years ago. So the effects of this split within Christianity we can still see when we talk about Southern Baptists or Northern Baptists, or even when it comes to Presbyterians and Methodists. It completely split Protestantism in the United States. Officially, as a schism, they formed two separate churches, and I believe it was a Methodist that actually occurred in the year 1844. And it's over this interpretation of the Bible. It's this same split, and it's this side, this literal side, that is saying we must read literal to literal, and therefore, as the United States is Israel, we have to practice slavery, segregation, all of the things we see practiced by ancient Israel. I want to quote Jedediah Morse's son, Samuel Morse, the I believe co-inventor of the telegraph system, the Morse code, or the Morse code. To quote Jedediah Morse's son, in the 1850s, Samuel Morse became well known as a defender of slavery, considering it to be sanctioned by God. This was a position held by many Southerners and others. In his treatise, An Argument on the Ethical Position of Slavery, he wrote, "My creed on the subject of slavery is short. Slavery per se is not sin. It is a social condition ordained from the beginning of the world for the wisest purposes, benevolent and disciplinary, by divine wisdom. The mere holding of slaves, therefore, is a condition having per se nothing of moral character in it, any more than being a parent or employer or ruler." So Jedediah's son, Samuel Morse, he continues the exact same methodology as he becomes a defender of slavery in the 1850s. And his explanation of it was designed by God, by divine wisdom, all the way back from the beginning of the world, heading down through ancient Israel to the time of Noah. This is the thinking of the South. It is a literal to literal interpretation of Scripture. And we understand that Ellen White and our pioneers, but not just Ellen White and our pioneers, a whole branch of Protestantism disagreed with that literal to literal interpretation and stood on the right side of the slavery question. 1888. What happened with 1888? It's the same thing. You don't have a Protestant schism occur, but you still have this split. Not every Protestant denomination or pastor supported the enforcement of Sunday laws through the government. So in 1888 history, you have the same split. And when I draw this, I'm referring to a split within Protestantism. And this one side, as we've described here with Jedediah Morse and what characterises his beliefs, is the exact same thing. It's literal to literal. And we read a quote by A.T. Jones last week, when now it's describing how Nehemiah was ruling in a true theocracy, a government of God. They're taking these Old Testament stories, applying it to the United States. The United States must be a government of God. The law of God was the law of the land. And God's will was made known by the written word and by the prophets. Therefore, the argument that the Sunday Law, National Sunday Law Union is presenting is that ancient Israel is the pattern for modern Israel. He says the preachers are the successors of the prophets. A.T. Jones breaks this down. The government of Israel was a theocracy. The will of God was made known to the ruler by the prophets. So for ancient Israel, you have a king, and the king is told what to do, what to enforce by the prophets, who are instructed by God. And if the king disobeys, what happens to the nation? Destruction. So when you bring that down to modern Israel, you have the president, and now it's not, they don't call them prophets. It's the preacher, the Protestant preacher, who is instructed by God. And if the president disobeys the preacher, what happens to the nation? Quoting A.T. Jones, the government is to be made a theocracy. The preachers are the successors of the prophets. They are to compel the officers of the law to prevent all selling of goods and all manner of work on Sunday. This shows conclusively that these preachers intend to take the supremacy into their hands, officially declare the will of God, and compel all men to conform to it. So they must do this through the laws of the land, which is why we have the history of Sunday laws in this history. It's a literal reading of inspiration, and behind it is this idea that the current leadership, unless this is enforced, that there is this deep state that is satanic, which will bring upon itself the government of God unless they clean up their act and enforce morality. Coming down to our history, it's what we've seen from the 1790s through the formation of our faith, through the 40s and the 50s, the split within Protestantism is what we saw in the 1860s when, in 1863, when we had the National Reform Movement start, and then in the 1880s history, 1880s, 1890s with the Sunday Law. It's the same thread of Protestantism, but it is not all Protestantism. That there is a distinct split within Protestantism, and you need to know where to look. What characterises their belief system? Coming down to the Omega of ancient Israel, there are many different denominations within Protestantism and subsets of beliefs. We're looking at what unites, what type of methodology and mindset unites them. Coming down to 1989, we've spoken at length about Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. I want us to expand on that a little. If you were to look at Jerry Falwell and someone like Billy Graham, they disagreed on many parts of their faith, but there are things that united them, that made these leaders willing to work together. What I want to discuss coming down into 1989 history is dominion theology. This is a type of theology that grew out of the 1960s and 70s. So I'm going to do quite a bit of reading now I'm going to define dominion theology, and then I'm going to go to an article that was read the first Zoom meeting that we had. We had a Zoom meeting that was not taped. I'm going to go back and read through the same article that was read then, so I'm sorry for the repetition for those who were part of that meeting. To define dominion theology, this is just the Wikipedia article for dominion theology. Dominion theology is a group of Christian political ideologies that seek to institute a nation governed by Christians based on their understandings of biblical law. Extents of rule and ways of achieving governing authority are varied. For example, dominion theology can include, it names a few, but the label is applied primarily towards select groups of Christians in the United States. They can be theologically diverse, and it lists a number of them. We're going to look at one particular one today that has gained a lot of power, and that is the New Apostolic Reformation. Most of the contemporary movements labelled dominion theology arose in the 1970s from the religious movements asserting aspects of Christian nationalism. So it's this belief back here, led by Jedediah Morse, that the United States, like Israel, is a Christian nation. So you have a Christian nation. Continued through the issues in the 1850s, 60s, slavery, 1888, the same thing. It's literal to literal, it's Christian nation. It's the same, it's the mindset that's behind dominion theology. The United States is a Christian nation, and you've already picked up on those words, how they see. They go back to the Mosaic law. They see a nation governed by Christians based on an understanding of biblical law. So, depending on what commentator you hear speak on this, I listened to one who gave, it was only a few minutes long, and he made an interesting point. He wasn't a promoter of dominion theology. He was opposed to it. But this is just the Christian version of Sharia law. If you think of an Islamic state, all that an Islamic state will do is say that we have these writings and we should make sure that the Islamic law, that the religious laws through Islam are enforced by the state. They wish to see a political government instituting and enforcing Islamic law. That's the definition of Sharia law. All of this is it's just, if you can take that understanding of Sharia law and what some Islamic countries are doing and attempting to do, bring that to this issue, it's the identical thing. It's the idea of a nation governed by Christians based on their understandings, not of Sharia Islamic law, but of biblical law. So, if you're a proponent of dominion theology in the United States, Islam and Sharia law are not this dangerous, it's not just this dangerous infiltration of this church-state union. It is your direct competition, because you want what they want. It's just they will promote Islam, you will promote Christianity, but they are in competition. And we're going to particularly discuss the New Apostolic Reformation that began in the 1970s. This is all part of the same stream of which we have discussed the moral majority and Jerry Falwell. In fact, the head of the moral majority, a man who's named as the head of the moral majority, who was not Jerry Falwell, he actually began part of this. So I want to expand on the history of what led up to 1989. So prior to 1798, there's all these external events. And within these, at the same time as these external events are being observed, Protestantism is taking note of these external events, and it's creating an interest in what books of the Bible. There's a Protestant revival and a awakened interests in the books of Daniel and Revelation, in what they call the apocalyptic books of the Bible. So we have a reformation within Protestantism. As they're observing external events, they turn to the books of Daniel and Revelation, and it creates this second great awakening prior to 1798 and leading into that history. I want to read now from an article of The Atlantic called Waiting for the End. If we were to take these two histories and overlay them, you have 1798 and 1989. And this article, in The Atlantic, Waiting for the End, it was written by William Martin in June of 1982. So it's written back in this history. So this is an old article, nearly 38 years ago. He says, "The world as we know it is coming to an end. Not because some general or madman will push a button and reduce our planet to poisonous ash." So this is still in the history of the Cold War. We're some years before the end of the Cold War. So the world is coming to an end not because of this threat of nuclear annihilation that existed in the Cold War, not because the weight of a growing population will cause the Earth to lurch out of orbit. Rather, the end is near because God has had it planned that way for at least 1900 years. It's all right there in the Bible, in Daniel and Revelation. This is The Atlantic speaking, with auxiliary illumination from other key portions of Scripture. Just as surely as He created a fully furnished universe out of nothing in 6 24-hour days, nearly 6,000 years ago, He is now about to bring it to completion in precise accord with a detailed blueprint tucked away in His Word. So there's a renewed interest in Daniel and Revelation prior to 1798. And there was before 1989. Judeo-Christian history has seen numerous outcroppings of interest in biblical prophecy, usually in times of social upheaval, but few, if any, have been as widespread and influential as that are now flourishing in conservative Protestant circles. So again, there's liberal Protestant and there's conservative Protestant, and which one is being drawn to Daniel and Revelation? Conservative Protestant circles. No hard data is available, but millions of American evangelicals apparently believe that within the present generation, and probably sometime in the 1980s, Jesus will return to lay the groundwork for a glorious 1,000-year reign here on earth. Hundreds of Bible-believing preachers discuss the chronology of these latter days with confidence that what they are saying is as familiar and real to their congregation as the stories of Noah's Ark and the birth of Jesus. The same themes are proclaimed by such leading television evangelists as Oral Roberts, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Rex Humbard, Herbert Armstrong, Kenneth Copeland, Jack Van Impe, and on such lesser-known programs as The Voice of Prophecy, The King is Coming, and 11:59 and Counting. So a couple of those names we should start to be familiar with. We already know Jerry Falwell, Pat Robinson, Kenneth Copeland. These names are the people who have led, some of them still living, who lead even today in this dominion theology movement that has gained traction more and more in the last years. So we're seeing something that led directly to what we have today. Hal Lindsey's, in the 1970s, the New York Times named the best-selling author of the decade to be the author Hal Lindsey. His book, The Last Great Planet Earth, 15 million copies sold. These are prophetic books about the end of the world. Though its growth has occurred mostly within the last 2 decades, this movement based on biblical prophecy had its roots in the 19th century. He's going to take us from here and say, well, this is what we're seeing in the 60s, 70s and 80s. It had its roots back in the 1800s. The French Revolution and its aftermath had kindled interest in prophecy, as biblical students saw the destruction of papal power, the secularization of the state, and the rise of a religion of reason as being remarkably similar to events described in Daniel and Revelation. So there's external events in this history. There's external events in this history, particularly those that lead up from, I'm going to put in the history of 1773 because it ties in what's happening in Europe and America. It's not just the French Revolution, it's also the rise of the United States and this secular, non-religious government of freedom. But he's also listing the French Revolution, the destruction of papal power, 1798, secularization of the state, that's the creation of the United States, the religion of reason. And this also, these external events, as we've discussed, renewed interest in Daniel and Revelation. So this Atlantic article is tying these 2 histories together. Takes us back to our Alpha. Millenarian thought that the Protestant belief of the millennium flourished in the United States at this time. The most notable millenarian during the first half of the 1800s, however, was William Miller, a prolific writer who held camp meetings and tent revivals that built him a following estimated at 50,000 people. And it has a short discussion on William Miller, and they make some mistakes about some of the tenets of our faith there, but they're describing what's happened in this Second Great Awakening, and they see that the most notable member of this history as being William Miller and his interpretation of biblical signs. They describe how he set a date, how that led eventually to his embarrassment, and how these millenarians learned to avoid being over-specific. So in those 2 paragraphs, they give a brief description of that history and the importance of William Miller in that history. The beliefs of the Protestants in that history revolve around the 1,000 years and the rapture. So it's going to give a bit of a description. After the rapture, a 7-year period of tribulation will fall on those who are left behind. It will begin with the appearance of the Antichrist as leader of a 10-nation confederation. So I grew up in a situation where I had access to hearing various conservative trains of thought from those who believed the church was Babylon. Not that my family ascribed to that, but we had connections with people who do, to going to AYC conferences, very conservative Adventist youth conferences, to hearing Walter Veith and those who supported him. These various groups that didn't all necessarily agree with each other, but I had access to these various schools of conservative Adventist thought. And as I read this article, what interested me was how precise the Protestant view of the end of the world is, and while we disagree with many parts of it, how much we have in common. They believe that the Antichrist is a leader of a 10-nation confederation. So how are Protestants, what is their view going to be of the United Nations? Not very favourable. He will seem to be a man of peace and will side with Israel when it is threatened by a northern coalition, which is now generally expected to be led by Russia and to include Germany. This is back in the history of the Soviet Union, so they'd be thinking of Eastern Germany, the Arabs and Iran. His help will not be needed, however, because the coalition will be so devastated by earthquakes and pestilence that it will take 7 months just to bury the corpses. So this is their view of Revelation. So their Antichrist leads a 10-nation confederation. Realizing realization that the raptured saints, the faithful who were caught up, had been prudent to believe in Jesus, will cause 144,000 Jews and a multitude of Gentiles to accept him as Saviour and Messiah. They'll accept Christ. These converts, together with two outstanding prophets, possibly Moses and Elijah brought back to life, will win others to Christ. Unfortunately, these new Christians will be marked for persecution by the Antichrist, who by this time will have begun to show his true colours. So the Antichrist leads a 10-nation confederation. He seems to be favourable he seems to be peacemaking, a good person. But after the rapture, as there is this great work of reformation, the forming of the 144,000, this Antichrist, the leader of this confederation, will begin to show his true colours and will begin to persecute the converts. He will enter into Jerusalem and desecrate it, essentially. And then you have natural disasters and the plagues. The Antichrist will seek total control over humanity by requiring that every person wear a mark or a number, probably 666, in order to buy or sell. Those who refuse to accept the mark of the beast will be slain or will risk starvation because they cannot buy food. Those who accept it will burn forever in hell. At this point, the Antichrist will be joined by the false prophet, a religious leader associated with Babylon, often identified in prophetic circles as the Pope. It then discusses the assembling outside Jerusalem for an assault on the holy city. Christ returns in glory. You have the Battle of Armageddon. The Antichrist and the false prophet will be slain, thrown into a lake of fire, Satan bound in a bottomless pit for 1,000 years. With Satan out of the way, the saints will enjoy 1,000 years of peace. At the end of this period, in a kind of last sporting gesture, God will give Satan one more chance to work his evil ways, and the Prince of Darkness will tempt and win millions of people who became Christians during the 1,000 years. There will be one final battle before Satan and all unbelievers will join the Antichrist and the false prophet in the lake of fire. There are quite a few parts of that coincide with conservative Adventist teaching, especially as you think of how the Protestants have such a distrust of the United Nations, of globalism, of what they see as being this confederation of nations. Since premillennial doctrine holds that deterioration in economic, political, domestic and moral spheres will precede the second coming, many evangelicals, unsurprisingly, have felt that the end of the age is near. The most important catalyst of the current boom in prophecy studies, however, has unquestionably been the political restoration of the nation of Israel. The 1917 Balfour Declaration, which permitted Jews to settle in Palestine, 1917. The formal establishment of the State of Israel, May 14 of 1948. The date of which, according to Hal Lindsey, the prophetic countdown begin. So they're tracing the formation of the nation of Israel. 1917, 1948. But Israel cannot simply be in Palestine, but they must have control of Jerusalem as well. This came to pass in 1967 at the conclusion of the Six-Day War. So 1917, 1948, and finally in 1967, that last piece of the puzzle regarding Israel falls into place. And now from 1967 forward, these conservative Protestant circles studying the books of Daniel and Revelation can see that the end is near. So many pieces of the puzzle seem to have fallen into place that premillennial believers display enormous confidence in their interpretative ability. So they're seeing external events, just as we saw the external events from the history of 1773 to 1798 in Europe and the United States. Now these Protestants are seeing the external events, earthquakes, volcanoes, famine, Russian aggression in Afghanistan, the Afghanistan war, China's emergence as a world power, the rise of OPEC, the revolution in Iran, threats against Israel, unrest in Latin America, weakness of the dollar. So they're seeing things that we were meant to see. We were meant to see the Afghanistan war, the 10-year Afghanistan war, 1979. We were meant to see the revolution in Iran, 1979. These are signs for Adventists to see, to prepare us for the end, just as they were to see 1798 and the fall of papal power. Millerites were to look back on 1798 and see the external events, the rising of the lamb-like beast, the fall of the papacy. We were meant to see these external events, but we're not the only ones seeing them. And then what else do these Protestants see? Increases in abortion, explicit sex on cable television, gay rights parades, threats to the perceived morality of the United States. Now they're in trouble. Because if the end of the world is coming, and America is a Christian nation, the new Israel, the glorious land, which we also agree with, then what does the hope of the United States depend on? The success of the nation? The enforcement of morality through the government. Students of prophecy do, however, give serious attention to truly important problems, such as scouting out the Antichrist and identifying the mark of the beast. So prior to 1989, these Protestants are trying to identify what is going to be the Antichrist and the mark of the beast. This is where their methodology becomes very important for us to identify. The consensus view of the Antichrist is that he will be a Satan-supported, charismatic czar who will institute and enforce a political and economic dictatorship so complete that buying or selling will be impossible without his authorization, symbolized by some form of 666 on the hand or the forehead. The 10-nation confederation that will serve as his power base is widely identified as the common market. So it's tying into this new economic system that was growing in the 60s and 70s. The 10-nation confederation, whose giant computer complex in Luxembourg is said to be nicknamed the Beast, so there's the introduction of computers. Many are appalled at rumours that in a cashless and checkless society, economic transactions will require that each of us be assigned a number consisting of 3 sets of 6 digits to be invisibly tattooed on our hands or our foreheads. I just want us to not lose what we're doing here. This is Protestant thinking back here, preparing for the mark of the beast. And they're seeing that there's this tattooing into your body of certain information that allows you to buy or sell. And what did Bill Gates just prescribe to do? He suggests it's not exactly a tattoo, it's some type of laser technology. Bill Gates is suggesting a type of technology that would imprint a mark on a human being that would give them certain identifying characteristics. It would put their information into their bodies, and that information could impact whether or not that person is able to work. For example, Bill Gates is looking at society post-COVID-19, and he's saying, in the society post-COVID-19, how will we know if we're safe? If someone is to work at a job where they're meeting many different people, they can't socially isolate, so we should make sure that they are someone that is immunized or has had COVID-19 and is protected from it. So we can imprint into people their some type of mark that will identify whether or not they are immune to certain illnesses, viruses and diseases. If they have immunity, then they are safe to work in offices where they have a lot of interaction with other people. So this mark can impact whether or not someone can buy or sell. So what's currently happening is this panic in some circles of Protestantism that they have finally identified the mark of the beast. And the mark of the beast is Bill Gates because he's a globalist, and it's going to be because of this imprinting or this mark that's related to COVID-19. That's what they're saying. That's not what we're saying. And we're not saying it because hopefully we are not apostate Protestants. Unfortunately, many of us are. That's what we are. That's why we're worshipping the Apis bull. We have the same mindset and methodology. Unless we learn from parables. Back here in 1982, they have no Bill Gates with this type of technology. So they're looking at a different explanation, particularly one woman in the early 1980s. Now that various forms of 666 are prominently in use, spreads through fundamentalist networks as rapidly as the false reports that worms are used in McDonald's hamburgers or that Satan worship infests Procter & Gamble. So it's lining up this idea with these prominent conspiracy theories. But the most widely known collection of such information is Mary Stuart Relfe's books, When Your Money Fails, The 666 System is Here, and she wrote a number of other books, but these are the two key publications that were written in the early 1980s. So this is Mary Stuart Relfe. And I want us to consider the methodology that she uses. She's seeing the mark of the beast, this restriction on buying and selling through this new system that's being set up. It's being spread through globalism. And how does she back up her claims that the end times is here? Her claims is that there is a deep state. And it's satanic in its origin and satanically led. And you can know it is how? Using her examples. She'll bring up for you, she'll put before you a slideshow and she'll show you these documents and these photographs to show that Olivetti, Leah Siglia, NCR Computer Systems, Bosswork Gloves, Scotty Fertilizer, McGregor Clothing and Shirts made in communist China, shoes made in Italy, parts for Caterpillar tractors have all been found bearing 666 on their product code. So she's going to say, look, if you just look at my slideshow, you will see that all of these from different countries, from different companies, are all bearing satanic symbols, satanic logos. She will go take you to their product codes. It's through these symbols, she will say, this can't be a coincidence. You go to their product codes, you keep seeing 666. That must be an indication that they're all working together behind the scenes. They're all in union and it's a satanic deep state. Sears, J.C. Penney, Montgomery Ward are said to use computer programs that call for 666 as a prefix. The ominous number reportedly is also used by the World Bank, the IRS, Medicaid, the Selective Service. I hope you're identifying the methodology that she's using today and seeing its exact counterpart in the methodology used by those such as Walter Veith and Conservative Adventists. She's taking you apart, showing you these strange, if I was to use Walter Veith's type of language, isn't this interesting? How can this be explained? And he doesn't answer his question, he leads you to his question as if it's a thought in your own mind. How can it be? This doesn't make sense. It must be the evidence of a deep satanic state. So this is back in 1982. So she's going to show that she identifies the Antichrist as being Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt. When he reopened the Suez Canal in 1975, apparently he rode in a warship with 666 emblazoned boldly on its bow. Apparently tanks built for President Carter's Secret Service force were stamped with 666, as were metric rulers widely distributed in the United States during 1979. some perhaps to school children who were using an elementary algebra book entitled 666 Jelly Beans. In Israel, she writes, 666 is used as a prefix for Arab-owned vehicles, overseas telephone calls, and the national lottery, as part of a deep state effort to educate, prepare and condition the Jews to accept 666, which will be the number of their false Messiah and the Antichrist and his world government system. What's the threat? A one world government run by a deep satanic state. This is the author. After reading her book, I felt a little queasy at recalling that my take-home pay at the time I first developed an interest in biblical prophecy was $666.66, and that once while living in Massachusetts I had seen 4 nuns in a car whose license number contained the dreaded digits. We have to think about the methodology and where it's coming from. Is apostate, conservative Protestantism where we want to take our methodology from? And the conclusion of their methodology are many of the same conclusions that conservative Adventism has come to. And we think that those conclusions make us special, that somehow we're the only ones fearing this satanic deep state. And that we can prove that satanic deep state because we'll sit in a lecture hall in front of Walter Veith as he'll show us slide after slide of secret handshakes, of secret logos with satanic symbols, with 666 emblazoned in secretive places to show that they're all part of the same deep state. He is a modern Mary Stuart Relfe. They use the same methodology and despite some different views of millennialism, etc., come to the exact same conclusions. They started looking for the Antichrist. Mary Stuart Relfe believed it was Sadat of Egypt. That became difficult after his assassination, so they found others. They believed Henry Kissinger, because if they used their numerological system to investigate his name, they could attribute his name to being equal to the number 666. Strangely enough, none of these conservative Protestants seemed particularly concerned about Ronald Wilson Reagan. Ronald 6, Wilson 6, Reagan 6. He is the 666. But somehow when they come to him, this methodology doesn't apply. Why? Because he's their man. So they start advising. We're about to enter the time period of the Antichrist. You can see it through these secretive symbols. You can see that this confederation is united. So we're going to soon have difficulty to buy or sell once the mark of the beast comes. So Mary Stuart Relfe and others started recommending move to the country, erect a shelter, plant a garden on a small plot of land outside the city, set aside a bag of silver coins for every member of the family. So they start preaching country living, get out of the cities, plant a garden. More significant, one has to consider how this theology will manifest itself in the activities of the Christian New Right. So how is this theology, that they're at the end of time because of the external events and because of these teachings, how is this going to manifest itself? And you start seeing this now in the government of the United States. So when you have a Secretary of the Interior speaking to the House Interior Committee saying, I do not know how many future generations we can count on before the Lord returns. How is that going to impact the behaviour of government? For example, if you are a non-Christian liberal government employee, are you going to be concerned about the depletion of natural resources? Of course, it's a real thing. But if you subscribe to this type of concepts, are you going to have any concern about that? No. And this is what's behind his remark about saying, we don't know how long we've got left. Implying that we should not be greatly concerned with long-range husbanding of natural resources. Similarly, if a president were to appoint one or more pre-millennialists to key foreign policy posts, who at the confirmation hearings would think to probe for beliefs about the second coming, what incentive would they have to work for lasting peace in the Middle East, since they would regard a Russian-led attack on Israel as a necessary precursor of the millennium? And it goes through some details of how this would impact their politics. And if we remember some of those names that we read earlier, particularly Ralph Drollinger, he believes only a Christian can work in government, because only a Christian, a conservative Protestant with these beliefs will have the right attitude to take to those posts, including these of dealing with foreign nations. They then go into the methodology applied. When the literature of these premillennialists are written, they will use all types of quotes from all types of sources and refer to all of them as being experts in their field. It's the same thing we see today when you'll have them quote Russia Today, one of their favourites, these types of sources, and refer to it as a reliable source. They never are able to discern between two streams of information. Mary Stuart Relfe, she'll show you this satanic deep state. She'll take you to lyrics. The conspiracy theories of the assassinations of Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. Song lyrics such as "What the world needs now is love, sweet love." The Coca-Cola theme, "I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony." Why would Mary Stuart Relfe look to the Coca-Cola theme and see evidence of the satanic deep state? Do they want world harmony? No. World harmony is a precursor to this 10-nation system led by the Antichrist. It's an anti-American attack on Christian values, and she tells of being rendered immobile at learning that the Sex Pistols' irreverent "I'm an Antichrist, I'm an anarchist" was part of the lyrics of the #1 song in England. I sat through Walter Veith lectures where he pulled up song lyric after song lyric to show evidence of the satanic deep state. Same methodology, same conclusion. These examples of overreaching reflect poor scholarship and faulty journalistic technique rather than inherent weakness of doctrine. The study of Daniel and Revelation and similar biblical literature has enjoyed some popularity in these universities and seminaries since about 1960. It spread through both liberal and conservative universities. Premillennial teaching is probably most attractive to those who feel that the world, or at least their segment of it, is out of control. Make it great again, make America great again, and can be brought to a good end only by concerted supernatural intervention. Such feelings of being marginalized are likely to be especially acute when established ways of life are being threatened. So these people have the characteristics of being felt as being marginalized under society. And we saw that mindset of marginalization just grow exponentially under the administration of Barack Obama, when those Christian right nationalists started to feel marginalized in society. Exactly how the South felt, I would argue, before the Civil War, when they argued that the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln argued that he was angry not because he wanted to own slaves, but that he felt marginalized in a society that no longer would allow him to speak favorably of slavery without feeling persecuted. So this is just reading from 1982, this article in The Atlantic, what we've gathered from them. It never uses in this article the phrase deep state. I've put that in there to try and show that that's exactly what Mary Stuart Relfe and the others are starting to teach. They might ascribe to different views of what that looks like. They may not all agree with the 666 being on some product code as being relevant, but it's the same mindset that there is. If you have this evidence in something from China and something from Russia and something from France and something from the United States, if you have this from Coca-Cola and all these companies and it's in their logos, what is that telling you? That behind the scenes They're all united in secret societies. Doesn't matter if they're a Hamilton or a Jefferson, they're united in the Illuminati. It's a satanic deep state, and what do you have to fear? The coming together of earthly governments, because it will be the tenfold union of the Antichrist. And then when that Antichrist forms, it will appear benevolent, then it will persecute, so you better move to the country and grow your crops. And we see that it's happening so much more since 2019, COVID-19, and the conspiracy theories around globalism within Protestantism, around Bill Gates within Protestantism, and on this idea of the imprinting of a code that will allow you to buy or sell. I learnt all of this in conservative Adventism, and we think we're special. We're not. The Pharisees, did they think they were special and unique? Yes, they had the Sabbath. They had built walls between them and all the other countries. Perhaps if they hadn't have built walls between themselves and pagan Rome, they would have recognized that their thinking was identical to that of pagan Rome. They would have recognized that they were actually thinking the exact same way, that their idea of the first advent of Christ was the exact same type of Messiah as a Roman would expect if Rome was in the same position as what Rome wanted and had in a Caesar. They wanted Jehovah to look like Caesar. Their ideas of God and of the end are the same. Conservative Adventism may feel special and different and separate because we wear long skirts and we show it through our morality, just as the Pharisees did. We may feel we're special because we know that that obelisk in St. Peter's Square means something else. Catholics all know that. Our doctrine, our conspiratorial doctrines that are our own inventions and not found in the writings of our prophet, those inventions are actually what ties us and shows us that we have the exact same belief system and methodology as apostate Protestantism. You see that directly when you see the link between the type of methodology and the conclusions she came to when you look at conservative Adventism. And this is as real idolatry as the carving of the golden calf. The idolatry of the Pharisees led to the end of the Jewish nation. The idolatry of, I'm saying Walter Veith as a heading, there are others that come under, will lead to the destruction of Adventism. It will lead to the loss of hundreds of thousands of people of their salvation. People are questioning, why mention Walter Veith? Don't be so divisive. Don't attack him. Just, I'm going to use my words, give a peace and safety message. The time for a peace and safety message is behind us. If we subscribe to this type of idolatry, we are subscribing to the idolatry of Protestantism. We are worshipping the ancient Apis bull of ancient Israel. That's what we are to separate from, and the mechanism of that separation, as it was for ancient Israel, is parable teaching. So we are out of time for today. What I want to do when we come back is we've looked a little at this history of 1982, and we're aware of 1979 and this 10 years. External events to be recognised by Adventism, but they were for everyone. Rain fell on the just and the unjust. External events are there for Protestants to see, are there for Adventists to see. We know this 10 years is also the 10 years of the moral majority, leading to Ronald Reagan. I want us to see where this dominionist theology actually led to, how it's been demonstrated, particularly under the Trump campaign, and how it has also, I would argue, has split Protestantism. Something to think about. Could you fight against slavery in this history and remain a Protestant and reject Millerite doctrine? Yes. Did standing against slavery save you? No. 1888, Protestantism split. Many Protestants fighting against a national Sunday law with a correct version of the separation of church and state didn't save them. We need to understand our own history and what tests us. But there are there are more subjects that must be understood and accepted to be a member of God's true movement. So we'll close there for today, just in a summary. We compare and we contrast ancient Israel with modern Israel. But then we also compare and contrast the beginning of modern Israel with the end of modern Israel. We began to overlay them here. External events caused a revival that spread through the whole of Protestantism. William Miller, the Millerites, Adventism was one part that came out of that. There's a Protestant revival spread through the whole world in this history, 79 to 89, but particularly in the United States. Shows under the teachings of such people as Mary Relfe, as Kenneth Copeland, Drollinger, and others, as they also formed the moral majority to retake government, because if the United States is to be Israel at the end of the world, not the literal Israel, but the glorious land at the end of the world, it must be a Christian nation. Literal to literal interpretation. That's what we're finding today. And the point I'm trying to drive home is that Adventism is not safe. Just as Israel thought it was separate and thought it was safe from paganism, so modern Israel thinks they're safe from Protestantism, and we're not. Those walls have shielded us from seeing that we are the same. We have the same idolatry. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you for how good you have been to us, that you give us your parables. We know that we have much to learn. And Lord, as we look at this history and we see what's happening within Protestantism and the external events that impact both us and them, we see, Lord, that the great danger that exists for your people. I pray, Lord, that they'll be shaken from these conspiracy theories, that they won't take part in the idolatry of Protestantism that is looking in the wrong direction for the mark of the beast and for these testing times. I pray, Lord, that we'll understand correctly the books of Daniel and Revelation, that we'll understand correctly the writings of our prophet. I pray, Lord, that we'll understand correctly the testing issues of our time, that as Jesus showed another way to ancient Israel, that now in modern Israel, may your people see the truth for what it is. May we not be held down by our preconceived ideas and opinions, but when we see truth, may we be willing to let go of everything that holds us from that truth. I pray, Lord, that we will have this deep humility of heart to recognize where we have had errors and mistakes in our past and be willing to relinquish them. I pray, Lord, that you be with your people all over the world as they enter into your Sabbath hours, and as we in the Southern Hemisphere, as we come to the conclusion of ours. May we honour you and glorify you. May we honour your Sabbath just as much as your people have been required to throughout these years. May we also see the testing issues of equality and these other messages, Lord, that we must have a correct understanding of to do the work you've assigned us. I pray all of this in Jesus' holy name. Amen.